Welcome to the Impact Learning Visionaries podcast, where we celebrate the unsung heroes of the learning and development industry. As always, we'll be bringing some laughter and a bit of fun along the way, but more importantly, you'll get some incredible insights, key lessons, and unique perspectives on everything related and possibly unrelated to training and development. Let's get this show on the road. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Impact Learning Visionaries podcast. And today we have joining us Lawrence Jacobson. Lawrence has almost 2 decades worth of management experience in instructional design and the development and implementation of corporate and academic training programs, with specific focus on technology-enabled learning and blended learning programs. His mission in life is to create meaningful connection as inspired by lifelong learning that is both impactful and full of fun. Lawrence, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jason. Glad to be here.
Right, so let's kind of, you've got a quite a bit of experience. You've worked with many different customers in your kind of career. So maybe just start us off with a little bit of, who is Lawrence Jacobson?
Yeah, that's probably my favorite question. Hopefully it's going to continue in this way. I started off my career as a software engineer. I was working for one of the big banks in South Africa in the IT department, doing a lot of early work in desktop computers in the 90s, and a lot of programming as well. From there, I actually, at a certain point, decided I wanted to quit the IT industry, and I worked for a couple of years. I had a company. We were doing live music productions and events around South Africa. My particular passion was to go into very out-of-the-way, beautiful, natural areas and organize events in places like that. And I did events in the Drakensberg and all around the Cape and some areas around Gauteng. After a while, I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do full-time, and I did a course in web development that included web development tools. This is in about 2000, included tools like Dreamweaver and Flash. And my software engineering and programming skills helped quite a lot. And at a certain point, I got offered a job for an e-learning development company to develop interactive animations. In those days, we used to use a tool called Flash, and there was a programming language called ActionScript that actually drove the animations in that language. And I started off doing that, developing really fun little animations. And at a certain point, I was given opportunity by the company I worked with to do a client-facing role at an e-learning implementation at a client. The client, I can say, was Armscor. They're in the defense industry, and they wanted to implement e-learning within their organization, which included installing a learner management system and starting to develop online learning courses for some of the skills that they required within their organization. And I was chosen to run the project office for this project. And it was there that my passion for online learning, for instructional design, particularly learning analyst, developed. And I moved from a role of a developer into more of a client-facing role, which included analyzing learning needs for clients and also doing a lot of instructional design. And I think that's where my career really kicked off, and that was about 2004, 2005, and I've been working in those areas ever since. I've done work across industry.
I haven't heard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was saying I haven't heard about Flash and ActionScript in many years. And it's a bit sad because I remember it used to be such a powerful tool, and I can't remember the exact story about why it ultimately died out. So I think it had something to do with like a big corporate buying it and deciding they wanted to use. I think that maybe Adobe or someone had something to do with it. but it was a really, really great technology, and there was so much learning content developed in that technology. So I suppose that the interesting kind of thing is that you've been involved from a technology perspective, from a learning and development side, and you've seen almost this kind of continuum play out of the different types of kind of technology, starting with kind of Flash and action scripts, and kind of seeing how technology has emerged. Tell us a little bit about that journey, from a technology perspective. Like, how have you seen the industry, kind of embracing technology from the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and where we are today?
It is an interesting journey. I think the journey reflects the same path that the world has taken with technology adoption. Like in the late 90s, when we first all started getting onto the internet, I mean, most people were connected to the internet with what was a 56K modem. And that stayed around until probably about like the early 2000s, when all of a sudden broadband internet started becoming available. And that had a huge impact on e-learning. And as a web developer, I'm not really a web developer. I did a course in web development, but that didn't really follow it up, more went into the e-learning space. There were like rules that you used to have to follow if you were developing websites. And one of the ones was like, if you were going to have images on your website, no image could be more than 100K in size, which is tiny by comparison today, where people are putting up 5-10 megabit images without any problem. And this obviously really impacted the e-learning. It meant that we had to make the e-learning predominantly text-based. Images were used very sparingly. We couldn't use video. It was, you had to set up a specific configuration where you would have, let's say, a server on site at a company where video was stored. They could access all the other stuff via online, but if it was video that they had to see, then they would access a local server to get that kind of material. And that was a bit of a complicated setup that most companies weren't willing to invest in. So we were very limited in what we could do. Everything in a way was, as I say, developed almost like by hand, although we're talking digital. So we would actually create the HTML pages ourselves for the e-learning, and we would design the animations in Flash. And what's basically happened over the last couple of years, well, let's say the last 18 years, is that gradually technology has been increasing at a rapid rate, where we now, like, for people to have 100 meg connections to the internet is not uncommon. And if we're dealing with intranets within a company, they could even have speeds of transfer of a gigabit. So that's the first thing that enabled us to really start using multimedia in a much more impactful way. And that was a great change. But what has also happened is that a lot of tools have started to emerge, which made the e-learning development process a lot easier. One of the terms for these types of tools, they called them rapid authoring tools. And examples of these are like Articulate, Storyline, Adobe, Captivate, and a couple of other tools that suddenly became available on the market that allowed that all the mechanics of how the e-learning worked on screen was suddenly being handled by the tool. All you needed to do was to think, I would like to add, let's just say, a drag and drop interaction at this point in my, and the tool would actually create the mechanics that would allow that drag and drop to work. And so that made things a lot easier for e-learning developers. And what also started to happen was that companies themselves started to use these tools, and they would get their own learning and development practitioners to start learning how to develop e-learning. And that in itself was fraught in the beginning, because I think people who were experienced in classroom training found it difficult to make the leap from being a classroom trainer and having everybody in the classroom with you to suddenly becoming an online learning developer.
And I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, especially from a technology lens. Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of interrupt there for a second and just ask a question from a technology lens. It's you've given a great kind of description of the kind of evolution of the technology, and maybe even a little bit of a hint as to why, like, online learning or learning in general has always been criticized of being behind the technology curve. And I think it's been one of the industries that's maybe been criticized the strongest for not embracing emerging technology trends, and always being quite far behind where the kind of current technology, I suppose, the world is at with technology. Do you think that a large part of that is that limitation that you spoke about with the internet, or do you think that there's just practicalities that the industry doesn't really tend to embrace new technology?
And so it's a good point you make, particularly around that being behind the curve. I remember in like let's say in 2008, like e-learning was a hard sell, and we had sales cycles that could stretch even to 18 months with companies as it slowly worked its way through the company until they were ready to say we're ready to commit it. Whereas today, in the last, say, 10 years, people now contact us and say they want e-learning. So I think that there's been an adoption delay because companies weren't 100% sure if this was the right way that they were supposed to go. Funnily enough, I mean, one of the things that we were up against in the early days is that when, in corporates in particular, if a person went on training, it meant 3 days out of the office, or 2 days, or however long the training program was, but it was out of the office. The person was given a nice lunch at the training center, tea in the morning, tea in the afternoon, and that was kind of seen as a perk by people. You know, your boss would say, I'm going to put you on this training course, it'll be great. I'm not at work for 3 days, and I get treated really nicely. And all of a sudden we rock up and say, no, we're going to take that away. And so there was like a resistance to the idea of using technology and in what it could do. I think that one of the biggest factors obviously is being price as well with emerging technologies. And I just take a look at some of the work that we've done. I mean, like, it's now become so easy to include video and to create video, to develop 2D animation can be done like using templates and can be done really quickly. So whereas before these kind of additions to the material that we were creating were like really nice to have. Quite a few years ago, starting I think it was about 2016, I was doing work with a health and safety company based in Canada, and the idea was that we were going to use 3D imagery for the health and safety training. With industrial health and safety, so it was like for construction sites, mines, those kind of industrial health and safety, looking at topics like fall protection and working at heights, working in confined spaces. So the idea was that they were going to use 3D images, so it would be 2D representation, but a 3D model, which worked really well. And then they decided that they wanted to include also some 3D video of certain things. And what we found, we did it for a couple of the initial courses that we started, but they quite quickly dropped the 3D video element because they felt that the return on investment and cost was too high. The amazing thing is that's changing every day. And now I'm seeing so much more of an adoption of immersive technologies for training because of the fact that it is now becoming a lot easier to do. So I think that there's a price factor that comes into play as well, that sometimes delays people's willingness to say, well, let's try something new.
Yeah, and I think that price factor, I think, has been a common topic of conversation on this podcast, but in maybe subtle ways, because I think it was really the way that traditionally learning and development was seen in many organizations as this kind of cost center, as a kind of a place where you would just instruct someone that my team needed to be able to learn this stuff, and they would have to go out and try and source that and often it would be almost a siloed function in the company, and not necessarily almost having a seat at the table, being able to have a strategic role. And from the conversation, it seems a lot of that is now changing. A lot of the kind of recent changes, I think, the kind of pandemic had a big push on this because of the adoption of more digital technologies. But it's given kind of rise to the sense that learning and development people now need to almost be mini CEOs, be more strategic, be more aware of the direction of the company, where the company needs support, and be able to kind of stitch that together in terms of a learning and development plan to not just have the old conversation of someone needs leadership skills and please put them on a leadership course, to being able to more shift that conversation, saying the organization has got an issue in this area, and there's a people component of it, and I can support the kind of like the solution of being able to kind of solve that problem for them through a learning and development initiative. And I think that in a way is starting to kind of break down this divide where cost maybe becomes less of a concern, because it's always easiest to justify something when you have a return on investment conversation than when you have a cost conversation. So it was a long-winded way of me probably coming to a question, and that really is, when we're starting to look at modern organizations, looking at modern kinds of technologies, and you started to allude to this with the 3D and the immersiveness, but there's also this kind of concept of this kind of blended learning approach of using different pieces of technology and different things that suit different purposes. So as a technologist, as a non-technologist, that probably sounds quite frightening. As a technologist, that sounds quite exciting, being able to kind of piece together the right technologies for the right use case. In that sense, how are you looking kind of at this evolution from a traditional kind of browser-based learner management system, traditional e-learning, towards using technologies in more of a blended fashion?
I really like the blended approach, and I like a mix of, I'll call it a multimedia mix when this is possible. And we break down content and we break it down into small chunks. And we'll say, well, this piece would really go well as a video, and this piece will be nice as a podcast, or this might be a practical activity that we can get people to do within the workplace. So I think it's fascinating, and I think it's actually really exciting. I think, for example, I'm doing a lot of research still at the early days with using artificial intelligence tools. What excites me, I think, in one way is the idea of having almost like a chatbot, which is already in place in certain spaces, in places. So while the person's going through the learning, they could actually be talking and discussing with a chatbot certain things. I think that offers like a really exciting possibility, but also like immersive. I mean, we've used augmented reality, for example, in manufacturing environments where people can actually like use their phones, and they can like scan something on a machine part and get a whole lot of information at that point of need. So I think that the idea of just in time is also really important, because if I'm working and I'm busy, I might not want to have to absorb a whole body of knowledge to help me with an issue that I have right here and right now. I might want just like similar to like a Google search or a YouTube search that I do. I'm looking for something specific that's going to help me with something that I need to know right now. And so the ideas of being able to make that kind of information available to people on the job, I think, is also quite exciting, as opposed to them having to step off the job, do training, then step back into the job and try integrate what they've learned.
So if we can dive into that use case a little bit, because I think a lot of people are still a little bit unclear about the use of augmented reality, virtual reality in a training setting. And I think people are always looking for use cases, success stories, understanding kind of the impact that these types of technologies have had on those organizations. So would you kind of just expand a little bit on that example you gave and just share with us, what was the problem? What did you see as the kind of real impacts, or how did it move the needle in that organization?
Firstly, there's the fun element. Like, people really enjoyed it. And I think that is important. It's not the be all and end all. Doesn't always have to be like an entity. We're not in competition with the movie industry. But in some senses we are. If we're looking at there's this almost like a competition for people's attention. And the people who do it best are like movie, TV. But even if we look at social media and we look at like sites where people are constantly looking at 15-second videos and stuff like that, that is where a lot of the workforce are today. So I think that there was like a huge enjoyment factor with people where they had to like walk around and find things and find information and use what they had found to piece together and be able to complete it. It was around understanding of process and understanding of how like machines work, and we definitely noticed that it was successful. You kind of mentioned earlier, which I think is a really important point, is the positioning of where learning sits within the organization. And we look at like different ways of evaluating the success of learning. And one of the evaluations, which we seldom get to do as learning practitioners, is to actually identify if behavioral change has occurred. So what I say to clients is, if you would like to learn, if you would like to see that kind of metric following a learning intervention, we need to do baseline analysis first. So we need to go in and we need to involve management in the training. So it's not like as if we're going to take your staff, we're going to train them and then give them back to you. We need that involvement before and after. So in order to be able to say I guess why I'm saying that is the training program that we developed was part of a bigger program that the organization was undertaking, which involved change management, which involved management awareness of the goals of what the organization was trying to achieve, so that they could report on whether or not, and also like correct if necessary, so they could actually interact with their staff and say, this is what we're wanting to see. And there was clear direction for the people who were involved in the program as to exactly what it is that we were hoping to achieve. And I think that those elements are important. Then we added the training material, which people found enjoyable and they found it informative. And I think that when you have all of those factors together, you're looking at a very successful program. If I'm looking at things like virtual reality, firstly, it has such an impact. So we developed a training program that involved hazardous material identification. It started off with a person being carried out of a office park on a stretcher, an ambulance, and then there was a narration overhead that this person had been exposed to chemicals and could actually die as a result. But this like 3D video that played has a strong impact on people who are watching. And I think that this is also important because we look at often when we do learning, or when I do learning with the companies that I work with, we focus on the cognitive domain. And we're not looking at the other domains that are also important, like the psychomotor and the emotional domain. And I think that when people are immersed in an environment, and I'm thinking specifically, let's just say mining, we're training for the mining industry, where we can actually like get a person to put on a pair of goggles and they're in a mine now and they're walking down a tunnel. The impact that training has is going to be at a much deeper level than if we take the person out of the mind, put them in a classroom, and start talking about everything on a theoretical level.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a great point. I think, I mean, if you take a look at the industry in general, there's scary numbers when it comes to kind of injury rates, death rates. And I seem to remember a statistic which said it was like 120,000 or more injuries, I think in last year. And those were just the ones that were all related to like poor training or incomplete training or kind of inefficient training. So yeah, I mean, it's a great example. I think that especially for VR, safety training is almost a no-brainer. You kind of are exposed to almost like an environment where the stakes are high, but the consequences are zero. And when I think about all the other ways that we try and teach people these things, is through role playing and through theoretical knowledge, it just doesn't seem to have the same impact that these immersive technologies have in teaching them about the significance of these kind of scenarios. Just, I guess the kind of question I had next, just moving on from there, is if we take those all of these new technologies that are coming out, like immersive technologies, AI, all the ones that you've spoken about, they have had a very interesting effect in the world around us, and we're starting to we've been aware of it for a while, but we're starting to see this growing kind of impact that these technologies are having on the future of work, and how and this is why it's like interesting to speak to a kind of someone who's got a technology background like myself, is that the technologies that we're looking at with excitement are the ones that are almost disrupting the organizations and causing a lot of anxiety and a lot of kind of uncertainty in terms of, how do we function as an organization? How do we navigate this new world? And in and amongst this kind of noise is this understanding that the skills of the future are going to be these ones that, for want of a better term, we call soft skills. And it's fascinating that the technology that is disrupting the world at the moment, the world of work, creating this kind of awareness of soft skills, creating this awareness of needing to have more adaptability and change in organizations, is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the solution to that is embracing the very technologies that are disrupting the industry in the first place. So I don't know kind of what your thoughts are about that, and about, whether you're kind of starting to see that shift in terms of the industry, the technology industry, starting to kind of make companies more anxious, make them more aware of soft skills, and starting to see that kind of need for people to do more soft skills training.
It's a brilliant question, and I think you really hit the nail on the head. I was just with one of the banks this week. They've spent over the years billions and billions of rands in technology. But what I find quite interesting is that they've still got some technologies that are from the 90s. Tech that was built in the 90s. Some of that tech was built by companies like IBM and SAP, that IBM and SAP have long stopped supporting, but the bank has got agreements in place with the provider that they will continue to support the bank. So they've been like, well, we're not, we've got something that works and we're not changing it. And I find sometimes, particularly with banks, and I've got an intimate understanding of why. Once that software stack is working, you don't change it for nothing. If it's working and up and it's running, and you've got, like, most of the time, we'll keep it that way. So what I'm seeing is, it's almost like as if a lot of the technology is taking away some of the requirements to be so process orientated, because like the process can be managed by the technology. And what we need are people who understand, let's call it the soft skills, but let's call it the human skills of how to deal with humans. And so I haven't seen like I'll be honest, at this stage, I haven't seen, and maybe just the companies that I'm working with are fairly big. They change slower, where I haven't, at this stage, they still pretty much carrying on as if they, as always. But I also think that sometimes with a lot of the, what's called AI, what's referred to as AI, and the big impact that ChatGPT made in the, let's say, the non-technological world, where it suddenly became known to everybody what was possible, you still very much need the processes in place that exist. And what's going to happen, I believe, is that the people who know how to use and integrate these new technologies into the processes are the people who are going to shoot ahead by leaps and bounds, because it's not that so much that the technology is going to replace existing, in some respects it will, but it's not that it's going to replace people, but it's a tool that people can use. So I think at this stage, the impact is, I think more people are thinking about it, coming up with ideas of how it can be used, and but I haven't really seen a big shift where people are saying, okay, this is going to be what's going to be running our, let's just say, for example, strategy sessions. If we look at organizational strategy, I just recently worked on quite a fascinating course with a business school, one of our business schools in South Africa, on what they call strategic resilience, which is really about like living in a period of uncertainty, and how do you prepare for uncertainty and disruption, and how do they talk about like not bouncing back, bouncing forward, because bouncing back just means you were back to where you were when the disruption happened. They're looking at ways of how do we actually we experienced disruption, and how do we come out better after the disruption has happened. And some of this, if I look at some of the artificial intelligence, even a tool like ChatGPT can help if we're looking at scenario planning, let's say, for example. So I can ask the tool, give me potential scenarios. And while I might be able to quickly rattle off 3, the tool can suddenly give me 16 in the same amount of time. It still requires that the human interface to actually, okay, so now we've got these 16 scenarios. How are we going to work through them and plan, and which ones are we going to choose? So at this stage, I'm not seeing a massive adoption of it, but I do believe it's coming really soon.
Yeah, and I think, in terms of AI, and probably because of the size of your customers, I think one big barrier to entry is obviously that security aspect, is that currently these AI's engines are very open, and I think a lot of people were caught by surprise when they read the terms and conditions and discovered actually who owns that information and who owns those prompts and the responses to those prompts, and that there's no kind of real privacy. So I think the next evolution of AI are going to be probably closed large language models that kind of sit where the organization owns that technology. But I guess moving from there is the kind of almost a little bit of a playful question is, where in your mind would you ideally love to see the kind of learning industry and technology industry kind of in the next year or two? What type of technologies would you really like to see people starting to embrace and using in their learning strategies?
Okay, I guess I'm going to give it my honest answer about this. To me, it's not about the technology. The technology is important. It's incredible, and I love technology. But to me, it's really It goes down to the learning needs of the target audience and the needs of the organization. Like learning theory has evolved quite a bit since, like if we look at, like, let's say the 1930s, it evolved as like psychology as a discipline was also evolving. But yet the fundamental learning ideas that were discovered, let's say in the 40s and 50s, are still relevant today. So we've moved from behaviorism to cognitive learning styles to constructivist. Now everyone in the age of connectivity, we look at like connective learning and how people learn in social situations. And these are all very exciting. But the fundamental building blocks of all of these are still those same kind of learning theories from the past. So I think it's quite nice. We need to be aware of the past, and then all these excellent add-ons and new areas have come about. I think for me the most important thing would be and it touches on what you spoke about earlier, is what is learning's place in an organization and how does learning fit in? Because often I'm called in to solve a very, very specific problem. Like, we need to develop training on this, or we need to try affect behavior change in this area. What I'd like to see is our scope expanding so that we can be part of the bigger picture, what the organization is trying to achieve, so the organizational strategy. That learning and development is actually part of that strategic decision making, and that when those strategic decisions are made, decisions on how we're going to do, we can call it learning and development, we can call it a transfer of knowledge, or behavioral change, how are we going to affect behavioral change, are actually thought about, so that we're not just brought in to develop a course and then we say goodbye. It'll be greater to have the opportunity to engage with the company on a deeper level. And I think that there are tools that enable this, that are making this easier. So it's become much easier for me to collect data. If I want to, I can quickly put a survey together and send out a survey to 100 or 1,000 people in the company. We've got wonderful tools that will do analysis on that survey and help us to pick out trends, trend analysis. I definitely think the immersive technologies are also very exciting. My limited experience with them has shown that there is an impact when it comes to learning. Because if I can just go a little bit back, I mean, if we look at like people ourselves in day-to-day life, it's usually like as we're walking around and something happens that our learning receptors kick in to high gear. All of a sudden a problem arises that we haven't experienced before. And it's at that point where we actually really ready to learn. So how can we put learning into that kind of space? So one of the things that we do is like you have scenario-based learning and practical learning programs where we're getting people to actually do the work that they do. And while they're doing that and even making mistakes, and hopefully making mistakes, because that's when people become ready to learn. So I think the immersive technologies are going to be very helpful. I think it's going to change the way that people engage with learning. I also think the idea of having like really small pieces of learning as opposed to there will be courses that will take hours for people to go through, but often what people really need is maybe a 3 or 5 minute or even a 15-minute piece of training. And the more we can immerse it in real life situations so that the knowledge is easily transferable when back on the job, I think the better we will be heading.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Of course, the challenge now becomes is how we engineer those opportunities, and this brings me to kind of my final two questions I ask. And the first one in this case is we always ask two. One is about kind of sharing knowledge and sharing wisdom and experience, and in this case, I guess it's in order to facilitate that kind of future that you've kind of articulated so well, what do you think the if you're putting yourselves in the shoes of a learning and development manager inside these organizations, or a executive in these organizations that maybe didn't have a learning and development manager, or that just were thinking more broadly about learning, what would your advice to them be in terms of how to change their approach, kind of to be more in line with this kind of approach and this thinking?
You've probably heard this expression at one point when e-learning first started. Well, not even just e-learning, the idea of what they call facilitation as opposed to teaching. So the teacher stands up, and the teacher is the repository of knowledge, and there's this transfer of that knowledge from the teacher to the student. And then the idea of facilitation, and it's not just an online learning tool. In fact, it probably even developed when you started seeing facilitators in the classroom, is that they facilitate people being able to access the knowledge that they already know and explore to identify new knowledge. And there was a term, a nice little phrase that was used, like the old school teacher is what's called the sage on the stage, and the facilitator is the guide on the side. And I think that idea of the guide on the side is what I would advise people to. People need to open up the learning function. There needs to be encouragement for people to explore, because I'm doing something, I'm excited about this new skills that I'm trying to. Let me go out also and find what I would like to learn. So I think that learner-directed, but at the same time, the role of the facilitator is really important, because if we look at the term performance management, I've always considered performance management to be the alignment of the goals of an employee with the goals of a company. That's performance management. Is if you can get that alignment to happen, you get awesome performance. To me, disciplinary procedures are a sign that performance management hasn't worked. I see the same kind of approach to learning and development. How can we align the goals of what the organization needs to do? Because they say that one of the top skills, 21st century skills, is going to be the ability to unlearn and relearn. And I know I'm experiencing that constantly, and I love it. I happen to be that kind of person who enjoys learning new things. So how do we get that situation where people within companies feel free to a little bit of self-direction as well as guidance from within the company as to what is needed? So my suggestion would be to open things and give the people the target audience, the opportunity to be participants in the decision-making around what learning is needed and how they should go about achieving it.
Very good advice. And I think it also, speaks to more of these modern learning ecosystems that are kind of now starting to emerge, and this understanding that learning is not just top down, but it comes from all directions and is both comes from inside and outside the organization. Of course, none of this makes learning and development managers' lives any easier, but that's that I suppose that kind of change and that willingness to unlearn and relearn that you've described, why it becomes so important. And also that's that's from your previous one, is it's those who forget about history are doomed to repeat it. So final question that we always ask our guests on the podcast is if they can share with us a recent book, a podcast, or an event that happened that had a profound impact on them.
If I think of, all day long I read. That's my job, is reading. And sadly, I find it difficult at the end of the day to pick up a book and read. So I've been listening to audiobooks and listening a lot to podcasts. I find podcasts amazing. My favorite podcast is Huberman Lab, Andrew Huberman. He's a neurobiology professor at Stanford University, in neurobiology and also ophthalmology. And he does a lot of podcasting on specifically about something he calls neuroplasticity, which is one of his main areas of study, which is the brain's ability to grow, to rewire, to adapt. And so I find his podcast fascinating, called The Huberman Lab, because he covers like a lot of different areas. He's into peak performance is part of what he's looking for. But a lot of what he talks about is the cognitive processes that happen and how brains work, which I find quite fascinating from a learning and development perspective. So that to me, so I think that there's a lot of work happening in the neuropsychology space, but also around behavioral psychology, and so which makes me like question myself to say, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to change knowledge or behavior? And if I can do both, then that would even be better. So I think that field of study and of discussion. I'm also very interested in what's happening in the artificial intelligence space. So listening to a lot of podcasts on technology.
Yeah, I think that neuroplasticity is such an interesting space, and it really kind of changed, I think, a lot of our views. Apparently, it turns out you can teach an old dog new tricks. So yeah, I think it's it's definitely I think making people rethink their kind of I suppose a lot of their existing mental models. Right. So coming to a close, Lawrence, I just wanted to say a huge thank you for joining us today. It's always great to speak to people who have a wealth of wisdom and knowledge, and also just practical knowledge. It's sometimes good to know that when you spend so much time in the space about future talk and what's going on in the future, you sometimes lose sight of the pragmatic what's going on right now in the world today. And starting to kind of hear about some of the real practicalities, that organizations don't necessarily always have the ability to move at record pace, and sometimes you do have to make some kind of changes in organizations that aren't willing to change as fast as we'd like them to, and some of the obviously challenges in that. So it's been great. It's been wonderful to hear that kind of that story from the trenches, that sage advice, and it's been lovely having you on the podcast.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for the opportunity, and I've really enjoyed the chat.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Impact Learning Visionaries. If you found it interesting or helpful, please subscribe by clicking on the button down below so you don't miss our next one. Also, be sure to check out our Reality Bites blog for more information on how technology is aiding in learning development. Links are all in the description below. Go check it out. Thanks a lot. Bye.